Why did Hitler's armies sweep across Europe yet leave Sweden untouched? Behind the curtain of neutrality lies a story of secret bargains, dangerous compromises, and a nation that stood in the shadow of Nazi power without falling under it. Stay with us, because the truth about why Nazi Germany never invaded Sweden will change how you see World War II. A nation surrounded but unbroken. In the early years of the Second World War, maps of Europe painted a story of rapid collapse. Denmark had been overrun in a single day, Norway fell soon after, and Finland had endured the brutal winter war against the Soviet Union. Yet, amid this violent storm, one country remained remarkably untouched: Sweden. How did a relatively small nation, boxed in by powerful forces, manage to preserve its sovereignty when so many others had been crushed under the Nazi war machine? The answer lies in a complex blend of geography, political foresight, and a sharp instinct for survival. Sweden's geopolitical position in 1939 was both a curse and a blessing. On one side, it faced Nazi-occupied Norway. On another, Finland, a nation struggling to recover from its bloody conflict with the Soviet Union. To the south lay Denmark, already under Hitler's grip, while across the Baltic Sea, the shadow of the Soviet Union loomed large. Any miscalculation could have meant disaster, as Swedish leaders knew their country could be pulled into the maelstrom from multiple directions at once. At the helm during this crisis was Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson, a man not celebrated for fiery speeches, but for careful pragmatism. His government understood that neutrality could not simply be declared. It had to be defended, negotiated, and at times quietly bent to reality. Sweden's leaders embraced a philosophy of survival above all else. They carefully positioned the nation as neither ally nor enemy, a stance that allowed them to maneuver diplomatically even as German troops marched just beyond their borders. What is striking about Sweden's approach in this precarious period is the quiet but firm determination to remain independent. The Swedes knew their military strength was limited. With a modestly sized army and an air force still modernizing, they could not have resisted a full-scale German invasion. Instead of relying on strength, they leaned on subtlety. Survival depended on persuasion, compromise, and an ability to make oneself more useful standing than conquered. But neutrality did not mean passivity. Behind the political calm was a nation quietly bracing itself for the worst. Sweden launched extensive fortification projects along its borders, especially facing Norway and the southern coastline. Defensive bunkers, minefields, and reinforced air bases were constructed in record time. Military service was expanded, and while not intended to take on the Wehrmacht in direct combat, these measures sent a message. Any invasion would come at a cost, both in blood and resources. Sweden also carried a historical memory that influenced its choices. The nation had avoided direct involvement in European conflicts since 1814, when its last war ended with the loss of Finland to Russia. That century-long peace had become part of Sweden's identity, shaping its cautious stance in 1939. Leaders viewed their long neutrality not as weakness, but as a carefully cultivated shield, one they would not discard lightly. What makes this survival story more fascinating is the psychology of Sweden's population. In the early war years, the fear of invasion was constant. Air raid shelters were prepared, blackout drills became routine, and the government ran campaigns urging citizens to remain calm but vigilant. Newspapers often carried reports of nearby battles, reminding Swedes that destruction was only a short distance away. The sense of being on a knife's edge shaped the national character during those years, turning ordinary citizens into silent participants in the defense of their country. Yet, perhaps the greatest shield Sweden possessed was its reputation. In the world of international diplomacy, image often carried as much weight as armies. Sweden was perceived as a neutral bridge, a nation that could communicate with both sides without immediately provoking hostility. This status made Stockholm a hub for diplomats, spies, and secret negotiators. Messages were carried through Swedish channels, and information passed in its capital's quiet rooms often shaped decisions made in Berlin, London, and Moscow. Remaining unbroken was not just a military achievement, but also a diplomatic victory that kept Sweden relevant in a time when neutrality could easily slip into irrelevance. As the storm of war gathered around them, Sweden faced a dilemma unlike any of its neighbors. The choice was stark: resist and risk destruction, or navigate the impossible balance of neutrality while encircled by some of the most aggressive powers in modern history. That they survived at all is remarkable, but survival came with compromises that would soon blur the very definition of neutrality itself. If Sweden was a nation surrounded but unbroken, how did it manage to keep its stance of neutrality credible in a world where neutrality was almost a myth? Stay with us to uncover the details. Neutrality or hidden alliances? When people hear the word neutral, they often imagine a nation standing completely apart from the chaos, untouched and uninvolved. But in the case of Sweden during the Second World War, neutrality was never as simple as staying silent. Instead, it became a complex balancing act, one filled with whispered agreements, quiet accommodations, and subtle actions that blurred the line between neutrality and alliance. Sweden officially declared its neutrality in 1939, just as Hitler's armies swept into Poland and the Allies responded with declarations of war. Yet the idea of neutrality in such a conflict was nearly impossible to uphold in the strictest sense. To survive, Sweden had to make choices, some of which leaned heavily toward favoring one side over the other, even if never openly acknowledged. One of the earliest tests came in April 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Suddenly, Sweden was bordered directly by German-occupied territory. Though Swedish leaders reaffirmed their commitment to neutrality, their actions revealed a subtler strategy. For example, when German troops requested transit rights through Swedish railways, Stockholm did not immediately reject them. Instead, the government permitted limited passage, sometimes under the guise of humanitarian or logistical needs. In reality, these trains often carried soldiers, equipment, and supplies vital to Hitler's campaigns in the north. The Swedish government justified these concessions as necessary to prevent outright invasion. Denying German demands, they feared, could provoke a swift attack, while compliance, though morally questionable, might keep the nation safe. For ordinary citizens, however, the sight of German uniforms on Swedish soil created unease. The country's neutrality was beginning to look like a carefully choreographed performance rather than a clear-cut policy. Beyond these quiet concessions, Sweden also engaged in subtle forms of diplomacy that leaned toward collaboration. One of the most notable examples was its control of communications. German forces required access to Swedish telephone and telegraph lines during the Norwegian campaign. Stockholm granted permission, but simultaneously monitored these channels in secret, gathering valuable intelligence. This double-edged move highlighted Sweden's pragmatic approach: cooperate enough to keep the Nazis satisfied, while quietly using the situation to their own advantage. Sweden's neutrality also extended into the world of trade, where choices spoke louder than words. The country's economic ties with Germany deepened as the war expanded. Swedish exports, including machine parts, steel, and other essential goods, became crucial for sustaining the German war effort. Critics later accused Sweden of profiting from the conflict, trading with the aggressor while claiming impartiality. But from Stockholm's perspective, refusing trade would have risked economic collapse and possibly provoked military retaliation. The Allies were not blind to this double dealing. British leaders, particularly Winston Churchill, grew frustrated with Sweden's willingness to bend toward Germany. Churchill described Sweden's neutrality as morally hollow, accusing the nation of aiding the enemy under the thin veil of independence. His words stung, but Swedish leaders pressed on, convinced that bending was better than breaking. Yet neutrality also gave Sweden certain advantages. Because it was seen as an intermediary, Sweden became a valuable channel for diplomacy. Messages from occupied territories, prisoner exchanges, and even covert negotiations passed through Stockholm. At times, Allied and Axis representatives could find themselves in the same city, carefully avoiding each other yet using Swedish soil to facilitate sensitive missions. Sweden's neutrality was, paradoxically, what made it indispensable in a world otherwise divided by total war. Even within its own borders, Sweden's neutrality was contested. Politicians debated how far cooperation with Germany should go, while citizens and journalists questioned whether the government had surrendered too much. Some felt betrayed, believing the nation had sacrificed its principles for safety. Others accepted the harsh truth. Survival sometimes demanded uncomfortable compromises. The grey areas of neutrality were not just political, but deeply personal. Swedish sailors faced constant dangers in the Baltic, where their merchant ships risked attack from both Allied and German forces. Diplomats walked tightropes, ensuring their words never leaned too far in favour of one side. And Swedish citizens, reading foreign reports, struggled to reconcile their nation's public stance with the rumours of quiet deals made behind closed doors. What makes Sweden's neutrality fascinating is not that it existed, but that it functioned in layers. On the surface, the nation claimed impartiality. Beneath, its leaders were calculating which concessions could buy safety without completely losing independence. And below that, shadows of secret arrangements revealed a reality where neutrality became a shield for survival rather than a strict principle. By the middle years of the war, Sweden's neutrality had acquired a reputation as something closer to selective alignment. The country could not afford to resist German pressure outright, but it also quietly sought ways to remain useful to the Allies. In doing so, it carved out a precarious place in history, a place where neutrality was less about staying out of the war and more about redefining what it meant to survive inside it. But if neutrality was blurred with hidden alliances, what made Sweden so valuable that even Hitler preferred agreements over conquest? Come with us to find out more. The Iron Lifeline to Hitler. When historians look back at the Second World War, they often highlight tanks rolling across Europe, planes darkening the skies, and ships prowling the seas. Yet behind all these machines of destruction lay one essential ingredient: raw materials. Without steel, there could be no tanks. Without iron, there could be no weapons. And much of that vital iron came from one unlikely source: neutral Sweden. Long before the war erupted, Germany had already recognized the strategic importance of Sweden's iron ore. The ore mined from the northern regions of Kiruna and Gällivare was considered among the purest in the world. Its high quality made it especially suited for producing hardened steel, the very backbone of German weapons production. By the late 1930s, nearly 40% of Germany's iron supply came from Sweden, a dependence that gave Stockholm enormous leverage, but also placed it in a dangerous spotlight. When war broke out in 1939, Britain quickly understood the same thing Germany had. Swedish iron could tip the balance. If Britain could cut off those supplies, it could cripple the Nazi war machine. British intelligence estimated that halting shipments of Swedish ore might bring German military operations to a standstill within months. This made Sweden's iron mines not just a national resource, but a target of global significance. The iron did not move invisibly. During winter, when the northern port of Luleå froze, shipments were transported through the ice-free Norwegian port of Narvik. Long trains rumbled through snow and mountains, carrying ore bound for German industry. The Allies, recognizing this lifeline, considered bold operations to sever it. In fact, one of the driving motivations behind the British and French plan to intervene in Norway in 1940 was precisely to cut Germany off from Swedish ore. This plan unravelled once Germany preemptively invaded Norway, securing the shipping routes for itself. For Sweden, the iron trade was a dilemma with no easy answers. To stop exporting would anger Hitler and invite retaliation. To continue meant indirectly fueling a regime waging war across Europe. The Swedish government chose a pragmatic course: keep the trade flowing but negotiate terms that kept their sovereignty intact. Iron became the bargaining chip that bought time and space for Sweden to remain uninvaded. The sheer scale of the exports is staggering. Year after year, millions of tons of ore were delivered across the Baltic and through occupied Norway. Each shipment represented not just metal but also the uneasy compromise Sweden had made with its powerful neighbour. Germany, for its part, valued this arrangement so highly that it tolerated Sweden's nominal neutrality, rather than risk disrupting the flow through military action. But it wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality. Swedish ore's purity reduced the need for laborious refining, meaning German factories could churn out weapons faster. Tanks like the Panzer IV, artillery pieces, and aircraft engines all relied on steel forged from Swedish iron. Without it, German production would have slowed dramatically, giving the Allies more breathing room. The Swedish mines, remote though they were, became silent engines of war across the continent. Sweden, of course, did not advertise this role. Official statements emphasized neutrality, but the facts told a different story. German dependence on Swedish ore was an open secret, and Allied leaders never forgot it. Winston Churchill himself criticized Sweden harshly for putting economic survival above moral duty, arguing that their trade sustained the enemy at a critical time. Yet the Swedes countered that cutting ties would have meant certain invasion, transforming their cities into battlegrounds like Warsaw or Oslo. What is often overlooked, however, is how Sweden used this dependency to its advantage. Negotiators in Stockholm drove hard bargains, securing fuel and manufactured goods from Germany in exchange for ore. This gave Sweden a degree of economic stability while Europe collapsed around it. Their leaders knew full well that the ore was their shield. So long as Germany needed it, conquest would be postponed. Still, this balancing act grew harder as the war dragged on. By 1943, when Germany's fortunes began to falter, Sweden started to quietly reduce its reliance on the Reich and restore connections with the Allies. But during those critical early years, iron was the lifeblood of Hitler's army, and Sweden was its supplier. Beyond supplying iron that kept Hitler's war machine running, what secret compromises did Sweden make that extended into hidden troop movements and shadowy agreements? Stay here as we reveal everything. Trains, troops, and silent compromises. Neutrality may have been Sweden's official stance during the Second World War, but neutrality often lived in the shadows. Beyond speeches and policy statements, there were quiet concessions, subtle agreements, and choices that pushed Sweden into morally grey territory. Few episodes illustrate this better than the story of German troop transports through Swedish soil, sealed trains that rolled across the country, officially labelled as medical support, but in reality carrying something far more troubling. When Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, the Scandinavian balance shifted dramatically. Sweden suddenly shared a border with an occupied nation, and German military demands began to arrive with greater urgency. Among these demands was the right to move personnel and supplies through Sweden. For a neutral state, granting such access was a clear violation of impartiality, yet the threat of invasion loomed too large to ignore. Stockholm faced a stark choice: comply quietly or risk provoking the might of the Wehrmacht. The compromise came in the form of sealed trains. These were rail transports that, on paper, carried medical staff and supplies to support German forces in Norway. Swedish authorities, seeking to preserve the image of neutrality, accepted the explanation. Yet eyewitness accounts and later reports revealed a different truth. Inside those carriages were not just doctors and bandages, but heavily armed troops, artillery pieces, and communications equipment destined for the battlefield. A Swedish representative in Berlin confirmed what many suspected. These trains were far from humanitarian missions. Reports noted that for every medical officer aboard, there were dozens of fully equipped soldiers. Artillery and anti-aircraft guns rattled inside the carriages, a far cry from the stretchers and surgical kits that had been promised. The trains became symbols of the delicate compromises Sweden made. Enough cooperation to appease Germany, but hidden enough to maintain plausible deniability. For the ordinary Swede, these troop movements were both unsettling and humiliating. Railways were a national lifeline, yet now they carried foreign soldiers under the watch of German officers. Many civilians resented the silent intrusion, but dissent was tempered by the knowledge that open resistance could bring devastation. Neutrality, it seemed, was not always about staying uninvolved. It often meant quietly accepting what could not be prevented. The sealed trains also reveal the extent to which Germany relied on Sweden's cooperation. Norway's rugged terrain and poor infrastructure made supplying troops a logistical nightmare. Sweden's rail network, modern and efficient, offered a convenient corridor for sustaining the German occupation. Hitler's generals understood this, and the Swedish government understood the danger of refusal. By granting limited passage, Stockholm kept its borders intact, though at the cost of credibility. Yet Sweden was not entirely passive. Officials carefully monitored the transports, gathering intelligence on troop numbers and equipment. This information, though not always shared immediately, contributed to Sweden's growing role as an intelligence hub. The same trains that symbolized compromise also provided opportunities for quiet observation, a reminder that survival often meant playing both sides at once. Critics later argued that these troop concessions undermined Sweden's claim to neutrality. If a neutral state allowed one belligerent to use its railways, how neutral could it truly be? The Allies were particularly skeptical, suspecting that Sweden was leaning too heavily toward Germany. Churchill's frustration with Stockholm deepened during these years, as Britain saw its northern neighbour not as impartial, but as complicit in sustaining the Nazi war effort. From Sweden's perspective, however, the trains were a grim necessity. Rejecting Germany's demands could have triggered an invasion, turning Stockholm into another Warsaw or Oslo. The government calculated that limited cooperation, however unsavoury, was the lesser evil. In their eyes, survival justified compromise. These troop transports did not last forever. By 1943, as Germany's power waned and Sweden re-established ties with the Allies, the practice was gradually reduced. But during the critical early years of the war, those trains clattering through Sweden's forests and cities embodied the uneasy reality of neutrality under pressure. They were the price of avoiding occupation, even as they blurred the very boundaries of impartiality. Sweden may have yielded to German demands by letting trains cross its borders, but what of the land itself? Could its dense forests and harsh mountains become the very battlefield the Nazis dreaded most, one they could never win? Come with us to see what lies ahead. A fortress of forests and mountains. Imagine standing on the Swedish border in 1940, looking west toward occupied Norway. The terrain that stretched before you was no flat plain inviting conquest. Instead, towering mountains, thick forests, and icy rivers formed a natural barrier that seemed to whisper a warning. Here, no invader would pass easily. Geography may not often receive the glory of tanks or aircraft, but in Sweden's case, it was a silent defender, shaping Hitler's calculations in ways few appreciate today. Sweden's landscape was among its greatest shields. The Scandinavian peninsula is carved by vast mountain ranges, dense woodlands, and thousands of lakes that turn into frozen fortresses in winter. The Kjolin Mountains, marking much of the Norwegian-Swedish border, provided a formidable wall of stone and snow. Any army attempting to cross would have faced steep passes, avalanches, and an unforgiving climate that punished even the most seasoned troops. For Germany, already stretched across multiple fronts, such terrain posed an unnecessary and costly gamble. The forests added another layer of defense. Stretching endlessly, these woods concealed countless paths, hiding places, and ambush points. Military planners knew that an invasion through such terrain would slow down mechanized units. Tanks and trucks, the backbone of modern warfare, would have been forced onto narrow roads where they were vulnerable to sabotage. Even lightly armed defenders could inflict serious damage from cover, turning Sweden into a nightmare for invaders. Then there was the water. Sweden's geography is defined by rivers and lakes that break up the land into natural obstacles. In peacetime, these waterways were a source of commerce and transport, but in wartime, they became potential defensive lines. Crossing them under fire would have been perilous, and with so many scattered across the country, German forces would have found themselves repeatedly stalled. Sweden also possessed one of Europe's most unique naval challenges, the archipelagos. Thousands of rocky islands line its coasts, particularly around Stockholm and along the southern shores. Any sea-based assault would have required navigating narrow channels where defenders could hide artillery and mines. Germany's navy, already stretched in battles against Britain, would have faced daunting risks trying to force a landing on Swedish soil. But the land was not only difficult, it was also vast. Sweden's sheer size meant that even if an invasion succeeded in securing border regions, maintaining control over the entire country would have been a logistical nightmare. Supplying troops across mountains, forests, and frozen tundra required resources Germany simply could not spare while it was fighting on the Eastern Front in North Africa and preparing for an eventual Allied counter-offensive in the West. Sweden's leaders understood this natural advantage and prepared to use it. Defensive lines were reinforced along likely invasion routes. Bridges were rigged with explosives, ready to be destroyed at the first sign of attack. Thousands of young Swedes were trained in guerrilla tactics, prepared to melt into the forests and harass enemy supply lines. The Swedish government quietly calculated that even if they could not stop an invasion outright, they could make it so costly and slow that Hitler would hesitate to attempt it at all. The psychological impact of this geography cannot be overlooked. German commanders, planning their campaigns, already had examples of how terrain could cripple an army. The Soviet winter had destroyed Napoleon, and the harsh conditions of Finland's winter war had humbled Stalin's Red Army. Adding Sweden's natural fortress to Germany's already overstretched commitments was a risk Hitler seemed unwilling to take. The land itself, indifferent and untamed, acted as a deterrent more powerful than many armies. Sweden's terrain also intersected with its culture of resilience. Centuries of living in such environments had shaped a population used to surviving harsh winters and rugged landscapes. In the event of invasion, many citizens could have adapted to guerrilla resistance, using the forests and mountains as allies. Occupation would not have been a quick march to Stockholm, but a grinding struggle against nature itself. Military historians often debate whether Germany could have succeeded had it launched an invasion. While no outcome is certain, one fact remains clear. Conquering Sweden would have required enormous manpower, heavy equipment, and time, resources that Germany was already burning through at alarming rates. Hitler's war machine thrived on swift, decisive campaigns. Sweden offered none of that. Instead, it promised a drawn-out ordeal with little reward beyond what Germany was already securing through trade. So the land itself became Sweden's quiet ally. Without firing a shot, the forests, mountains, and waterways whispered caution into the ears of German planners, reminding them that some battlefields are better left untested. Geography, so often overlooked, played a decisive role in preserving Swedish independence. Yet even the strongest fortress cannot stand without provisions. Geography could protect Sweden from armies, but what about the economy that kept its people alive? Let us tell you the economics of survival. While mountains and forests guarded Sweden from direct invasion, it was not geography alone that kept the country safe. Beneath the surface of diplomacy and terrain, another weapon ensured survival: economics. Trade, resources, and financial strategy became the lifeblood of Sweden's wartime neutrality. What made this balancing act so extraordinary was not just the goods exchanged, but the way the Swedish government transformed commerce into a shield as powerful as any army. From the very beginning of the conflict, Sweden understood that isolation was impossible. The country depended heavily on imports for its industries and food supply. Roughly 1/5 of its imports came from Germany, including coal, vital for heating homes and powering factories. Without access to German coal, Swedish cities would have faced brutal winters with little warmth, and industries would have slowed to a crawl. In return, Sweden's exports, including iron, steel, and machine parts, fed into the German war effort, creating a delicate web of interdependence. This two-way trade gave Sweden a unique form of leverage. Germany desperately needed Swedish resources to keep its armies moving, but Sweden also needed German supplies to keep its own society functioning. Neither side could afford to cut the other off entirely. By maintaining this balance, Stockholm created a form of economic deterrence. Invading Sweden might disrupt the very flow of resources Germany relied upon. But the story of Sweden's wartime economics went beyond raw trade figures. The government played a careful game of negotiation, ensuring that concessions to Germany were balanced with subtle advantages for Sweden. For example, while agreeing to supply iron ore, Sweden demanded favorable terms on other goods, securing machinery and fuel that sustained its economy. These negotiations were not signs of submission, but calculated moves to extract as much as possible from an uneasy partnership. Sweden's neutral stance also allowed it to keep trading with the Allies, though often through indirect and covert channels. When German blockades made shipping difficult, Sweden developed alternative routes, including daring airlifts and smuggling operations, to send crucial ball bearings to Britain. These tiny components may have seemed insignificant, but they were essential for tanks, aircraft, and naval engines. Without them, Allied production would have suffered. In this way, Sweden's economy was not only a lifeline for Germany, but also a secret artery for Allied strength. What is particularly striking is how the economy became a battlefield in its own right. Every shipment, every negotiation, and every concession carried political meaning. Germany pressured Sweden to favor its side, while Britain applied equal pressure in the opposite direction, at times threatening blockades or sanctions if Sweden leaned too far toward Berlin. Swedish leaders had to weigh each decision with extraordinary care. Too much cooperation with Germany risked alienating the Allies. Too little risked provoking invasion. The balancing act extended into finance as well. Swedish banks became discreet havens where both Axis and Allied interests intersected. Transactions flowed through Stockholm, sometimes cloaked in secrecy. Sweden's financial institutions quietly managed dealings that allowed the country to profit while maintaining its posture of neutrality. This financial strength gave the government more room to maneuver and reinforced the country's ability to survive prolonged isolation if circumstances changed. The economic dimension also shaped public life in Sweden. Citizens felt the effects of rationing as imported goods grew scarce. Coffee, sugar, and even fuel were tightly controlled. Yet compared to the devastation elsewhere in Europe, Sweden's standard of living remained remarkably stable. This stability was not accidental. It was the result of careful economic management that prioritized survival while avoiding open confrontation. Critics, both then and later, accused Sweden of profiting from war. They pointed to the steady flow of exports to Germany as evidence of collaboration. Yet defenders argued that survival left little room for moral purity. Without these economic concessions, Sweden might have shared the fate of Norway or Denmark, its independence shattered and its cities occupied. The uncomfortable truth was that commerce kept Sweden alive, even as it implicated the nation in sustaining both sides of the conflict. By the later years of the war, Sweden began to pivot economically. As Germany's fortunes declined after 1943, Swedish trade leaned increasingly toward the Allies. Renewed links with Britain allowed shipments of ball bearings and other critical goods to flow more openly. In effect, Sweden shifted its economic weight just enough to ensure it would be on the right side when the conflict ended. Once again, survival guided the strategy, and once again it succeeded. What makes Sweden's wartime economy so fascinating is its dual nature. It was both a lifeline for Germany and a quiet supporter of the Allies. It sustained the nation at home while giving it bargaining power abroad. And above all, it proved that neutrality in war could be sustained not only by soldiers or terrain, but by careful control of money, goods, and resources. Yet trade and finance were only part of Sweden's survival strategy. Economics could keep the nation afloat, but could they shield it from the political and moral storm of aiding two enemies at once? Come along as we uncover the hidden story. Playing both sides of the war. By the middle years of the Second World War, Sweden's neutrality was no longer a simple stance. It was a balancing act on the thinnest of wires. The government had to make sure that its concessions to Germany were enough to avoid invasion, while also keeping ties with the Allies alive so that, when the war ended, Sweden would not stand accused of collaboration. This required extraordinary maneuvering, where every shipment, every message, and every diplomatic exchange carried double meaning. Sweden, in effect, played both sides of the war, and for years managed to get away with it. One of the most striking examples was Sweden's role as a supplier of highly specialized goods. German industry devoured Swedish iron, but the Allies soon came to depend on Sweden for something equally critical: precision ball bearings. These small but indispensable components were used in engines for aircraft, tanks, ships, and even submarines. Without them, machines would grind to a halt. Britain, in particular, valued these supplies so highly that it orchestrated elaborate smuggling routes to ensure their delivery, even under the constant threat of German blockade. At the same time, Sweden kept feeding Germany. Machine parts, steel, and other exports continued to cross the Baltic, sustaining Hitler's war machine. To outside observers, this double trade looked like duplicity, but to Swedish leaders it was survival strategy. If they cut Germany off entirely, they risked invasion. If they refused the Allies, they risked isolation once the war ended. Playing both sides was not about loyalty. It was about ensuring Sweden lived to see peace. But trade was only one layer of this double game. Information became another powerful weapon. Sweden's intelligence networks quietly gathered data from German communications, troop movements, and supply routes. Much of this information, carefully filtered, found its way to Britain. Reports about naval convoys, submarine activity, and even German intentions in occupied territories passed through Stockholm to London, strengthening the Allied hand. While Sweden never trumpeted this role publicly, its intelligence contributions proved invaluable. Stockholm itself became a hive of espionage. The city's neutral status made it one of the few places where spies, diplomats, and informants from both Axis and Allied nations could operate in proximity. Cafes, hotels, and discreet meeting rooms became the settings for exchanges that shaped strategy on both sides. German officers met with Swedish intermediaries, while Allied agents conducted quiet negotiations. It was a world of shadows, where neutrality meant hosting secrets rather than staying uninvolved. This position carried enormous risks. If Germany had discovered the extent of Sweden's intelligence sharing, retaliation could have been swift. If the Allies had concluded Sweden was giving too much to Hitler, trust would have evaporated. Navigating this dangerous middle ground required precision, and Swedish officials worked tirelessly to ensure that neither side believed they were being betrayed outright. Even humanitarian efforts became part of this balancing act. Sweden allowed safe passage for refugees, particularly Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, and provided medical aid where possible. These actions gave the nation moral credibility in the eyes of the Allies. At the same time, Swedish authorities were careful not to broadcast these efforts too loudly for fear of angering Berlin. Humanitarianism became another layer of Sweden's delicate diplomacy, a gesture of conscience balanced against the need for self-preservation. The public in Sweden often struggled with this double-sided policy. Citizens read news of their government exporting resources to Germany, even as they heard rumors of secret cooperation with Britain. Some felt ashamed, believing their country had chosen profit over principle. Others accepted the grim reality. Survival required compromise, and compromise required duplicity. Neutrality in theory was clean and noble. Neutrality in practice was a constant negotiation with danger. By 1943, as Germany's fortunes declined, Sweden began tilting more visibly toward the Allies. Ball-bearing exports to Britain increased, and intelligence sharing grew bolder. This shift was not sudden loyalty but pragmatic foresight. Leaders knew the tide of war was turning. Ensuring good relations with the Allies would secure Sweden's place in the post-war world. Once again, the government adjusted its position with care, leaning just enough without tipping too far. In hindsight, Sweden's ability to play both sides is one of the most remarkable aspects of its wartime survival. Few nations managed to supply Hitler's armies and Churchill's factories at the same time, all while feeding intelligence across borders and sheltering refugees under the cover of neutrality. It was a high-stakes gamble, but for Sweden it worked. Sweden had learned to play both sides, but how did the world view this performance? Was the nation admired for its survival skills or condemned for profiting from war? Stay with us to know what really happened. Global eyes on a neutral pawn. Sweden may have considered itself neutral, but the world was watching closely, and not everyone was convinced. To the Allies, neutrality often looked suspiciously like collaboration. To Germany, it looked like reluctant obedience. As the war intensified, Stockholm's every move drew scrutiny from foreign leaders who judged the nation not only by its words, but also by its actions. In a world where neutrality was nearly impossible, Sweden found itself less a sovereign actor and more a pawn in the eyes of global powers, useful, tolerated, but never fully trusted. Winston Churchill was among the loudest critics. The British Prime Minister, blunt and unsparing in his assessments, described Sweden's policy as one of weakness rather than principle. His frustration stemmed not only from Sweden's iron ore exports to Germany, but also from its willingness to allow German troop transports through its territory in the early years of the war. To Churchill, these concessions gave Hitler strength while the Allies bled on the front lines. In speeches and private letters, he questioned whether Sweden had sacrificed morality for the illusion of survival. Britain's anger was not purely moral, it was strategic. The British understood how vital Swedish resources were to the German war machine. Iron ore shipments from Sweden kept German tanks rolling, while Swedish steel and precision machinery strengthened Nazi industry. For Britain, struggling under the weight of German bombardment and naval blockades, watching Sweden supply its enemy felt like betrayal. Neutral or not, Sweden was shaping the battlefield by the choices it made in trade and diplomacy. Across the Atlantic, the United States also eyed Sweden with suspicion. Though not immediately involved in the European conflict, American observers tracked Sweden's economic ties to Berlin with growing unease. Reports from diplomats painted a picture of a nation profiting from both sides while hiding behind the shield of neutrality. For US officials, the moral stakes of the war made such behavior difficult to accept. Yet even they acknowledged the complexity. Sweden's proximity to Germany left it with few safe options. Germany, on the other hand, saw Sweden less as an ally than as a convenient tool. To Hitler, Sweden's cooperation was never about friendship, but about necessity. So long as the ore shipments continued and the railways carried troops when demanded, Sweden's independence could remain intact. The moment those concessions stopped, however, Germany made clear that it could reconsider. Swedish diplomats who met with Nazi officials frequently walked away with the impression that Stockholm's autonomy existed only at Berlin's pleasure. In this way, Sweden was less a partner than a tolerated pawn, its survival tied directly to its usefulness. Yet, global perceptions were not always harsh. Some leaders, particularly within the Allied camp, came to recognize the subtler contributions Sweden made. Intelligence sharing with Britain, for example, helped identify German supply routes and naval activity. Refugees who escaped through Sweden's borders often carried valuable information with them, further strengthening the Allied cause. Though these actions were not always publicized, they softened Sweden's reputation in certain circles. For those who knew the secret layers of the game, Sweden's neutrality looked less like weakness and more like strategic cunning. Still, the world's judgment was deeply divided. Neutral countries such as Switzerland and Ireland were often lumped together with Sweden, seen as outsiders who profited while others fought. The perception of standing aside while millions suffered created resentment, even when the realities were far more complicated. In many Allied nations, newspapers carried critical stories about Sweden's exports to Germany, painting a picture of greed over principle. Public opinion hardened, and Sweden's name became a byword for neutrality that was not truly neutral. This scrutiny influenced Sweden's own leaders, who worried constantly about their reputation once the war ended. They understood that survival during the conflict was only half the battle. The peace to come would be shaped by how nations remembered their conduct. If Sweden appeared too close to Germany, it risked being treated as a collaborator. If it leaned too far toward the Allies, it risked German wrath before victory was secured. The government's choices reflected not only a desire to avoid invasion, but also a careful calculation about how history would judge them. Per Albin Hansson, Sweden's Prime Minister, often framed neutrality as a burden rather than a shield. In parliamentary debates, he defended concessions to Germany as painful but unavoidable. Yet he also encouraged quiet efforts to aid the Allies, knowing that this dual approach might one day redeem Sweden in the eyes of the world. His leadership reflected the tension between short-term survival and long-term reputation, a tension that defined Sweden's wartime experience. Ordinary Swedes, too, felt the weight of global scrutiny. Many were acutely aware that their nation's neutrality was viewed with suspicion abroad. Some citizens volunteered in humanitarian missions, assisting refugees or supporting resistance movements in occupied Norway and Denmark as a way to balance the moral ledger. Others defended their government's choices, arguing that survival required pragmatism, not heroics. Within Sweden itself, debates raged about whether neutrality was a proud tradition or a shameful compromise. The complexity of these perceptions reveals the unique position Sweden occupied during the war. It was not admired like Britain for its defiance, nor pitied like Poland for its suffering. Instead, it was studied, judged, and often mistrusted. In global eyes, Sweden was never fully neutral. It was a country maneuvering within limits, tolerated because it was useful, criticized because it was safe. And yet, despite all the suspicion, Sweden emerged from the war intact, its cities unbombed, its sovereignty preserved. This survival alone was a remarkable achievement in a Europe scarred by destruction. But the price of that survival was the lingering question. Had Sweden acted wisely, or had it compromised too much? The world had opinions, but the answer lay in the shadows of choices never fully revealed. If the global powers saw Sweden as a pawn, then what did the final judgment look like when the war ended? Was neutrality viewed as cunning diplomacy, or as weakness dressed up in pragmatism? Let us take you inside the untold truth. Neutral or weak? The final judgment. As the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, Europe emerged scarred, battered and transformed. Cities lay in ruins, nations counted their dead, and the geopolitical map was redrawn. Yet in the far north, one country stood almost untouched. Sweden's cities had not been bombed, its borders had not been violated, and its sovereignty had survived intact. To many observers, this outcome seemed remarkable. But the question that lingered was whether Sweden had succeeded through strength and cunning diplomacy, or whether it had merely been too weak to risk defying its neighbors. Neutral or weak? The debate continues to this day. For its leaders, Sweden's survival was proof of careful judgment. Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson and his government had steered the nation through 6 years of turmoil, avoiding both invasion and starvation. Their strategy had been pragmatic, rooted in the understanding that neutrality could not simply be declared. It had to be defended through negotiation, trade, and sometimes painful compromise. By preserving independence, they believed they had safeguarded Sweden's long-term future. But critics, then and later, saw things differently. Churchill's biting words about Swedish neutrality being a form of cowardice echoed in post-war debates. The evidence of ore shipments, troop transports, and machine parts supplied to Nazi Germany was difficult to ignore. For many in the Allied camp, Sweden had enriched itself while others sacrificed. Neutrality, they argued, had been less about courage and more about self-interest, shielding Sweden while indirectly prolonging the war. Inside Sweden, opinions were just as divided. Some citizens felt pride that their country had escaped destruction, convinced that survival itself was the highest achievement. Others wrestled with guilt, wondering whether their nation's compromises had betrayed the moral duty to resist tyranny. The sight of refugees welcomed into Swedish territory, including thousands of Jews rescued from Nazi persecution, gave the country a humanitarian legacy. Yet those same efforts could not fully erase the memory of trains carrying German troops or ships laden with ore bound for Hitler's factories. The international community's verdict was equally complex. On one hand, Sweden's survival allowed it to play an important role in post-war Europe. Its intact economy, unscathed infrastructure, and functioning industries positioned it as a valuable partner in reconstruction. Sweden quickly became a hub for humanitarian aid, supporting devastated neighbors and offering mediation in international disputes. Neutrality, in this sense, gave Sweden credibility as a peace broker in the decades to follow. On the other hand, the shadow of wartime choices lingered. For years after the conflict, historians and politicians questioned whether Sweden's survival had been bought at too high a price. Was neutrality merely a convenient label for quiet collaboration? Or had the government truly walked the only path available, caught between powerful enemies with no realistic chance of resistance? One perspective views Sweden as pragmatic rather than weak. The country's leaders understood their military limitations and turned to the tools they had: geography, trade, and diplomacy. They used iron ore as leverage, trade routes as bargaining chips, and neutrality as a shield. In this interpretation, Sweden's survival was not passive but active, a demonstration of political skill under impossible conditions. The opposing view is harsher. From this angle, Sweden's choices appear as self-preservation at the expense of others. While neighboring nations endured occupation, famine, and destruction, Sweden remained safe, its industries humming, its citizens spared the worst horrors. Critics argue that this comfort came in part from compromises that strengthened Germany and prolonged the war. Neutrality, in their eyes, was weakness dressed in careful words. The truth lies somewhere in between. Sweden was neither heroic resistor nor shameless collaborator. It was a small nation caught in a storm, making choices day by day to avoid annihilation. Some of those choices were compromises, others were acts of quiet defiance, and many lived in the grey space between. Neutrality was not pure, but it was effective. Survival came with moral cost, but it also preserved a future for generations who would otherwise have faced occupation and ruin. Were you surprised by the hidden reasons that kept Sweden safe while its neighbors fell to Nazi occupation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.